Our next speaker, Dr. William Blair, will discuss the dirty business of combating disloyalty. In his presentation, he'll explain how we often talk about the hard measures used to win the war on the battlefield, but we don't often consider the hard war that was fought away from the battlefield and in the streets of even those communities that were loyal to the Union. Dr. William Blair is the Ferree Professor of American History, the director of Richard Civil War Era Center at the Pennsylvania State University, and the editor of the Journal of the Civil War Era, a scholarly journal for the history of the sectional crisis through Reconstruction. He is also the editor of the Brose Lecture Series with the University of North Carolina Press. In 1996, his dissertation won the Allen Evans Prize for the best dissertation in American history from Society of American Historians. He was named a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. In addition to articles and chapters in books, Blair has written several books. His latest is titled With Malice Toward Some, Treason and Loyalty in the Civil War Era. Please welcome Dr. William Blair.
Thank you, and thank you for all coming here on this kind of gloomy day. I'm afraid I've got a gloomy subject for you as well. I think I'm going to give you a slice of the Civil War that you may either little know or may not know at all. And I want to take you back by sharing an incident from this conflict. The day was May 27th, 1862. It was about 1 p.m. 4 civilian provost marshals, accompanied by 4 Union soldiers, all of them bearing arms, entered the courtroom of Judge Richard Bennett Carmichael in Easton, Maryland. The Talbot County Court was in session. A jury had been impaneled. The judge had presented about half the evidence in the matter before the interruption came. One of the civilian provost marshals notified the judge that he was under arrest. When the judge asked why, the response came, quote, "That will be made known to you hereafter or at the proper time," unquote. In other words, we're not telling you. The judge refused to acknowledge the authority of the men, and he kept trying to summon the sheriff to the court to help keep order. And this effort, of course, was blocked by the marshals, one of whom said that if the judge resisted further, he would, quote, "blow out his brains," unquote. Eventually, the civilian marshals closed in on the judge as he sat on his bench. A witness then reported 3 men were striking at Carmichael with the barrel of their revolvers until they had soon covered him in blood. Then they dragged him from the courtroom and they took him to Fort McHenry, where he spent more than 6 months under military arrest until his release in December. He never had a hearing, as he sat in a fortress that, if you think about it, had been the inspiration for the Star-Spangled Banner, an anthem of liberty. Why the heck would soldiers interfere with and pistol whip a sitting judge who was holding a legal proceeding? It was a legal hearing in a loyal state. Maryland was loyal, where the civil law was functioning. It wasn't military law. Well, it turns out that the orders came down from the highest levels. In this case, William Henry Seward, the Secretary of State, and the decision was made by the commanding general on the ground to conduct the arrest while the court was in session, because he wanted to send a message and get the attention of the opposition. Carmichael had been on the radar as someone who had spoken out against the policies of the Lincoln administration when it came to arrests of civilians by the military. The case for which he charged the grand jury that day involved the arrest of supposed hecklers who allegedly intimidated Unionists during an election. And as you'll hear later, I'm sure there was intimidation. Carmichael considered these kinds of arrests as arbitrary and unconstitutional, and he was charging the jury to authorize civil authority to arrest those soldiers and any federal agent who committed such indiscretions. Lincoln wasn't sympathetic to Carmichael. He thought the judge was trying to, quote, "find a safe place for certain men to stand on the Constitution whilst they should stab it in another place," unquote. So Carmichael remained in military prison for another 5 months. Well, I spent some time on this example because I think it gets to the heart of many issues in my book, With Malice Toward Some, which is a study of how Northerners used and abused notions of treason to battle what they perceived to be disloyalty on the home front. Now, we often talk, as you heard, about the hard measures used to win the war on the battlefield, but we don't always consider the hard war that was fought away from the battlefield and in the streets of communities that were loyal to the Union. What it took to win the Civil War was often very dirty business, in which the Constitution at times became stretched, and soldiers committed acts that, quite honestly, should raise our eyebrows. We might at times think of ourselves as unique when debating contemporary issues, such as combating terror, conducting surveillance of cell phones, or imprisoning suspicious people in Abu Ghraib indefinitely without charges. Yet, the American Civil War involved many more instances on a much larger scale. And in winning the Civil War, virtually every cornerstone of freedom sustained a few cracks. This was not always conducted, by the way, by the high and mighty, but perhaps even more often by the low and the mean. Well, let's start with freedom of press, which we certainly treat as sacred today. During February of 1863, an estimated 75 soldiers convalescing in a hospital in Iowa somehow mustered enough energy to rise from their sickbeds so they could wreak havoc on an allegedly disloyal newspaper office. About 3 p.m., the soldiers marched on the office of the Daily Constitution, which I suspect was a Democratic newspaper. The men with hammers took hammers, demolished a printing press on the first floor. They then went to the second floor, cleaned out the type, and destroyed another press. And then on the third floor, they found yet another press, and they threw it out the window in an obvious fit of pique. Armed soldiers arrived at the scene to curb the destruction. But these convalescents, all of them soldiers, did not easily intimidate. They resisted until finally the arriving military actually trained their weapons on them. Eventually, the convalescing soldiers formed into line and marched off, but not before they dragged the presses to the river. Well, I don't actually know what triggered these men to shake off their various ailments to attack a mechanism essential to a free society. But it was more common than you might think to have runs on presses or to have the government arrest editors whose columns appeared to sympathize with the rebellion. One study has suggested that throughout the entire Union, 111 newspapers were damaged by angry citizens. More often, however, editors who published unpopular opinions faced a suppression of their newspapers, the loss of mailing privileges by the government, which would curb their subscriptions or in distribution, or they would just imprison the editors for a little bit. Another historian estimates that perhaps 300 editors experienced these practices. For the most part, the jail time was brief, mirroring the usual practice in political arrests to gain a public pledge of loyalty and sometimes a statement of contrition. Often, the reason for such assaults and suppression of newspapers by the government was frankly nothing more than what we would call political speech. What struck me most, though, was not the official action by agents of the government, but the popular upwelling by people such as those soldiers in Iowa. A theme of the book is that the dirty business of policing disloyalty often originated at the grassroots level, where individuals were ahead of the policymakers in Washington. The soldiers in Iowa certainly waited for no permission from Lincoln to do what they did, or from their immediate superiors. And presses that endured such acts could not rely on the help of local comrades in the Fourth Estate unless they happened to share party affiliation. As you heard, if you were here for the earlier talk, objectivity was not a part of newspapers. Newspapers back then were partisan organs. They were actually representatives of the political parties, and they were not supposed to be objective, so that when rival editors went to jail for criticizing the administration, the editors on the other side did not storm the White House to protest for protection of the First Amendment. Instead, they cheered the demise of political rivals. Okay, the press, one sacred cornerstone. How about the churches? Surely, freedom of religion remained a sacred belief and offered protection from arrests. But of course, they did not. Politics permeated the sacristies. Ministers loved to express whether to be loyal to the government or to protest, and they were often watched by their congregations, by their denominational hierarchies, and by federal authorities for their potential to spread treasonous dogma or to fail to set the example of loyal behavior. My good example for you is on February 9th, 1862, the Reverend K.J. Stewart, I think he was Presbyterian, was taken during Sunday worship from St. Paul's Church in Alexandria, Virginia. Although Virginia was, of course, a Confederate state, this area had been seized by the Union very early in the conflict and was really under federal control at the time. Well, soldiers from the 8th Illinois Cavalry waited for the minister to omit the prayer to the president. There was a piece of the liturgy in which he was supposed to give the prayer for the president. When he ignored the prayer this time, the detective commanded him twice to say it. When he ignored the prayer again and ignored the officer, an officer and some enlisted men went to the altar and began to try to recite the prayer while the minister kept trying to continue the liturgy. Remember, church is going on, and there are people actually in the congregation. The soldiers eventually dragged the reverend from his kneeling position and announced his arrest, quote, as a rebel and a traitor, unquote. The minister, this guy, grabbed the chancel rails trying to resist capture during this time, which caused a brief stalemate. They didn't know really what to do with it because he was just hanging on and they didn't know what to do next until someone jolted the soldiers into action again. Two men reached down and pried him from the rail, forced the prayer book from his hands, and another drew a revolver. Soldiers dragged him, literally dragged him from the altar, dragged him down the aisle and outside the church and into imprisonment. Well, I wanted to give you the flavor of what this was like. It's one thing to say there was a political arrest, it's another to get the feeling of what is it really like when this occurs. Well, the general officer in charge of the department released this guy very quickly. They couldn't hold him, and that only enraged the more passionate unionists in the community. Remember, again, this is happening at the lower levels. They announced their displeasure by nailing a U.S. flag over the entrance to the general's office, and it was meant as an insult. It was an indication that the crowd did not believe him to be loyal enough. When it became known that the officer took down that flag, it prompted an even more extensive decorating campaign, this time aimed at all secessionists. The Stars and Stripes floated from hundreds of buildings in Alexandria then, and a main target was the church in which Stewart had ministered. Loyalists placed a small ensign at the peak of the roof and solicited funds for a larger flag on which organizers planned to inscribe, quote, raised by the Union citizens of Alexandria, death to the traitor that dares to pull it down, unquote. In other words, for these people, the federal government, as represented by the general in charge of the area, had not acted forcefully enough. Similarly, congregations policed their own without waiting for the federal government or for soldiers. From 1860 to 1865, formal complaints were lodged against 121 ministers at annual meetings of denominations only in the Midwest I'm talking about. In 1864, in a Pennsylvania congregation, Democrats came into the church and interrupted a preacher before a sermon to challenge him and ask him about his political leanings. If he was an abolitionist, they said, they would hang him. The minister made, I think, the very wise decision to escape the church through the back window. Well, Lincoln, by the way, had to step in twice to halt breaches of religious liberties. In late 1862, authorities in St. Louis seized the Presbyterian minister Samuel B. McPheeters and banished him from Union lines. The local provost marshal considered McPheeters really only the tip of the iceberg. He believed that all clergymen in St. Louis were disloyal, and he favored shipping every one of them out of the state. Lincoln had a meeting with McPheeters and concluded that, he probably really was a Confederate sympathizer, but the Reverend had taken the oath of loyalty, and he promised to say the prayer to the president during worship service. So Lincoln reversed the order and the decision to banish McPheeters. And then he said, and he issued this edict, he said, quote, the U.S. government must not, as by this order, undertake to run the churches. Well, you know, some of his subordinates were not really paying that much attention. In 1863, Secretary of War Stanton gave Bishop Edward Ames of the Methodist Episcopal Church the power to remove preachers he considered to be disloyal and replace them with clergy of his own choosing. Wishes of the congregation be damned. Although the order affected Confederate occupied territory in Tennessee and the Gulf, it also allowed for these measures in Missouri, which was a loyal state, although, as you probably know, Missouri should have an asterisk beside it. Anytime you say anything about the Civil War, you should say, but that's not Missouri, or, you know, Missouri was different. It was just a really strife-ridden state. Military officers, by the way, seemed only too happy to help with this policy, tossing out ministers in Memphis and St. Louis. And on the East Coast, in Norfolk, Major General Benjamin Butler instructed his provost marshals to assume control of all places of public worship, not just Methodists. He liked it so much he thought, what the heck, let's do this for everybody. Lincoln pulled the plug on these measures, which was good for him and good for the nation. So did the Union need to intimidate ministers who failed to say the prayer to the president in order to win the war? Probably not, but you know, that's not the point here. As we have seen, many Northerners thought so at the time, viewing ministers as people who could poison congregations and stand in the way of citizens volunteering to fight. Stanton put it this way in his order. He said, quote, "It is a matter of great importance to the government in its efforts to restore tranquility to the community and peace to the nation that Christian ministers should, by example and precept, support and foster the loyal sentiment of the people." That's their job. They don't do that job, we should arrest them and replace them. But frankly, not freedom of speech, not freedom of worship, but freedom of elections was really where the biggest surprises came to me in this particular project. And the way that the military, with the full sanction of the president, supervised elections really did surprise me the most. I hadn't known the extent of disruption of the sacred ritual of a democracy. And remember, Judge Carmichael was really a target because of what he was ruling on arrests that occurred during elections. This interference, by the way, occurred most frequently in the border states or the slave-owning states of Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware that had remained with the Union. And these states were critical for a number of reasons. I know you probably know this, but you know that strategically they controlled key invasion routes into the Confederate States. Demographically, they contained populations that could have swung the war with an infusion of soldiers to the Confederacy. And politically, they contained both die-hard and lukewarm Unionists whose votes could affect both the support for the war, but especially the advancement of emancipation. There were people in the North who feared that a tainted ballot could jeopardize reunion, and they favored strong measures that involved restricting voting. And we might have to count Lincoln among those people. But before I go further, I really need you to understand the historical context of voting then and how much easier it was to influence it. You may not be aware, but there was no such thing as a secret ballot then. In fact, that innovation waited for later in the 19th century, and we borrowed that from the Australians. That's where we got the secret ballot. Nor was voter registration a typical practice. You didn't do that at the time. In America, during the Civil War and before, voters came to the polls with pre-printed tickets. Many of them were clipped from newspapers. They were usually just one-party ballot. You often handed them over to an election judge, usually through a polling window. They were placed into one ballot for the Republicans, one ballot box for the Democrats. The point is, it was not unusual for them to be color-coded even, depending on the party and who was running. So the point is that from the time you hit about 50 yards from the polling place, almost everybody knew how you were going to vote. And in fact, a secret ballot was believed to be unmanly and to be somehow subversive and not declaring. You should be able to declare your vote in public. Election days, by the way, were hardly the serious affairs we participate in today. Much of the electorate was drunk or at least tipsy. For me, it reminds me of a Penn State tailgate with guns. And they were deliberately drunk by party leaders who really wanted to reinforce their votes with whiskey and try to, sway people to one or the other. But what you may not know is how violent elections were. Party leaders also hired shoulder hitters. And these were usually prize fighters or known thugs to intimidate voters from the other side by bumping them over and over. To get the picture, he's old now, but I think, can you imagine if Mike Tyson was standing over there in the corner and he was watching who was coming to the polls and he was hired by the Democratic Party to intimidate any voter who's coming in who's from the other party. And he would stand in your way, fold those arms, shove you, see if he can shove you down or against the wall and say, "Don't come in here." That would work for me, I have to tell you. I'm a coward. I would not go in. My colleague Mark Neely said, quote, "Violence lay very close to the essence of voting then. And the violence was administered by what he calls, quote, professional election bullies with fists for hire. And they used knives. Under the circumstances, it should come as no surprise to learn that people were murdered during Election Day. And between 1828 and 1861, 89 Americans were killed as they attempted to vote. In lesser crimes, of course, the parties spied on one another, hired detectives, and falsified votes. Lincoln, actually, in 1858 election, played the game of advocating hiring detectives to try to spy on the other party and even try to see if they were influencing votes. Remember, by the way, I am describing the political culture in peacetime. Peacetime. What happens when we have the tensions and add those into the pot of a country potentially falling apart during a civil war? Well, the military, you should know, interfered in elections throughout the border states as early as 1862. But the intrusions escalated the following year as troops supervised balloting in Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland. Military officials at times adopted what can only be called draconian measures. General Jeremiah T. Boyle, who was a radical Republican, had set himself up. Remember, this is a general. He sets himself up in Missouri, a place he was supposed to be ruling as a departmental commander. But he sets himself up as a candidate for Congress and then jails his opponent. Let me repeat that, okay? A military officer entering a political campaign, we don't do that today. Officers are supposed to keep politics separate. But this military officer enters the political campaign and then puts his opponent behind bars. That sounds bad enough, but as the late-night infomercials promise, wait, there's more. Then he declared that anyone voting for the Peace Democrat would be considered a a Confederate sympathizer whose property could be seized by the military. Boyle did not, shockingly, he did not win the election, revealing the public's distaste for his aggression. But Union Democrats did, and these were the guys who were more compatible with Lincoln's policies. They gained wide majorities in both branches of the state government as well as the governor's office, largely because of influence at the polls. Well, Maryland and Delaware provide interesting stories as well. In Maryland, the government clearly affected at least one congressional race as well as lesser political offices. The military commander of the region, General Robert Schenck, issued orders for provost marshals to arrest disloyal persons who approached polling places. How do you know they're disloyal? Because they're going to have the wrong ballot. They're going to be voting for the wrong side. And he also required judges of elections to administer oaths of loyalty to the United States. So anybody who came up and was going to vote had to take also an oath of loyalty. When asked to explain his actions by Lincoln, Schenck made a beeline to Washington, and he told Secretary of War Stanton that if his orders were revoked, quote, "we lose this state," unquote. I don't think that was the case, but nonetheless it was hard to judge. Lincoln probably became convinced that there was a chance for violence to erupt. Remember that political culture. It's not a smooth-running, fair culture or exercise of the ballot. And he probably did believe that unionists could be intimidated in that kind of context. He edited the order, instructing the military to maintain the peace, not arrest treasonous people. But he let the overall policy stand, allowing Schenck, the general, to post troops at precincts on election day, which he did. The most egregious interference, the one that struck me and I always like to share, occurred in the 1st District in Somerset County on the southern tip of the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. In the election for Congress from this district, an unconditional unionist, you have to translate that, unconditional unionist meant not only union, but I'm for emancipation and Lincoln's policies. That guy defeated John W. Crisfield, who was a unionist candidate. Again, that sounds like good, but no, that meant I'm for union only. I'm not for emancipation or the ending of slavery, and I'm not really on Lincoln's side. Well, the loser was intimately acquainted with events at a polling precinct in Princess Anne County on November 4th, 1863. On that date, a cavalry officer by the name of, I don't know his first name, but Captain Moore, shut down the election after exactly one person had voted in a precinct that traditionally featured 300 or more voters. And the person who triggered the cavalry officer to act was the second man to step up to cast his ballot, the congressional candidate's son. Arthur Crisfield had tried to vote legally for his father, but the military prevented him from submitting a ballot on his behalf. The cavalry officer grilled the younger Crisfield on his political beliefs. Was he loyal? Were you loyal? Yes, he answered. Have you taken up arms against the United States? No. Did you consider the rebellion an unholy war that ought to be put down? Yes. We're not done. Would you sacrifice your property to put down this rebellion? Yes. Well, finally, an election judge he stepped in and protested. He just said, come on, this questioning is slowing down the balloting so much, we're never going to finish within the allotted time. That was no problem for the captain. He ordered his soldiers to arrest the judges of elections, and he shut down the polling place, leaving on record the one and only vote cast. Well, in the neighboring state of Delaware, this is kind of funny. I hope your eyebrows are going up at this. Well, in the neighboring state of Delaware, also under the jurisdiction of General Schenck, one of the congressional campaigns took a strange turn. It took me a while to even figure out what happened, because this one particular peace Democrat, that would not be good for the Republican Party, an anti-emancipation candidate, opposed another in Congress to fill an election vacancy that was created because of a death. And to say that the Republican won in a landslide does not quite capture the strangeness of this picture. In more than 30 precincts spanning 3 entire counties and the city of Wilmington, the Democratic candidate captured 13 votes to his opponent's 8,000. Only 4 precincts reported any votes for him at all. 30 precincts, only 4 said even that there were any votes for him. Honestly, I looked at that and I went, what the heck is going on here? Was that more interference by the military? And the answer is yes and no. Schenck had put into place the same directives as he had in Maryland, the same kinds of loyalty oaths and same kinds of scrutiny by the military. But the Army really had very little work to do because of the unique reaction among Democrats. They boycotted the election. A few days before the polling, the Democrats in Delaware learned that Schenck intended to have soldiers support the election and screen who was qualified to vote, and it sounded like Maryland all over to them again. The Democratic candidate withdrew just before the balloting, and party leaders issued a public statement saying, voters, stay away from the polls. The members listened, allowing the Republican to earn a victory that was virtually unopposed. So there's another congressional seat that's going for Lincoln. When considering the election of the border states in 1863 then, it becomes very clear that the military's screening of traitors at polling precincts served the cause of an anti-slavery union. Favorable congressmen for the administration joined the 38th Congress from Maryland and Delaware, as well as from Ohio. A political scientist named Richard Franklin Bensell, and if you want a fun book to read that gives you the sense of this political culture, it's The American Ballot Box and the American 19th Century Ballot Box. But he did a very careful analysis of the impact of all of this. Unconditional unionists, he said, and remember, these are supporters of the administration from the border states who actually favor emancipation. Those who were elected from that particular area through these kinds of means gave the Republicans a working majority in the House. All of them won offices from elections in which the military assured the purity of the ballot, as they put it. Quote, without the support of the unconditional unionists, Bensell concluded, the Republicans would have fallen short of a majority by 5 votes when the 38th Congress convened. 5 votes. 4 of 5 pro-emancipation, pro-administration members had come from Maryland as a result of the 1863 election. A 5th had come from Delaware. Small wonder that Bensell added that many loyalists obviously believed that, quote, democratic principles had to be violated in order for the Union to survive. Well, frankly, there are other ways to influence voting besides screening voters at precincts, right? The executive branch had an incredible resource within its grasp in the persons of soldiers, who also remained citizens. And citizens, of course, had the right to vote. Male citizens above 21 would usually have the right to vote. And the administration became very adroit at shifting the pieces on the chessboard to use this resource to its advantage. Republicans first had to get around certain challenges in the mechanics of voting back then. When the war began, only one state allowed soldiers to vote when outside of their election districts. Once you got into the Army, it was believed you were too easily influenced, your vote may not be free, and so they did not allow soldiers to vote when they were away from their home districts. Everyone at the time considered that just the best way of going, but as you would think, that sends a heck of a lot of Republicans into the ranks, people who were probably the most enthusiastic in the beginning, and everyone knew that there probably was, especially in early responders to this crisis, maybe a majority of Republicans there. By 1864, by that presidential election, largely at the instigation of Republican legislatures, 19 states had adopted absentee balloting for soldiers. But in the meantime, the administration's solution became, before that time, to use its ability to control the military, to furlough the right regiments at the right time, to return to their home states in order to cast ballots. You pretty much know, if you ever study Civil War soldiers, really, I mean, they're raised from communities. The company is the basic unit, so they're coming out of areas in which you will find political persuasions within these particular units. Some will be Democrats, some will be Republican, and so on. And you can tell which ones are going to be which, just by even areas in which they come, from which they come. Anyway, in 1864, Lincoln still had Grant and Sheridan, even though there were much more absentee balloting, he still had Grant and Sheridan furlough 10,000 Pennsylvania troops to make it look like the home vote in the Keystone State favored him. In other words, he knew he could get the votes from the soldiers in the ranks, but it would look better if we actually had those totals coming from home. In advance of this election, Stanton, the Secretary of War, began to clean house. There was a purge within the departments. He began to fire clerks from the various bureaus who voted Democratic. Generals, by the way, in the Army, cashiered or demoted officers suspected of supporting the peace candidates. I think I'll wait till the little furor dies down. Thanks. In advance of elections, Stanton fired clerks from bureaus, of course, as I said. Generals cashiered other officers who looked like they were going to vote Democratic. Generals screened any of the newspapers or party materials that would be coming in and tried to keep Democratic materials out. The extent of this voter intimidation within the military has come to light in a really wonderful recent book by Jonathan W. White, which is a good book for you to pick up sometime and add to your shelves. Lincoln, of course, was complicit in many of these activities. Okay, so how do we put this all into perspective? Please don't think that I'm trying to resurrect the ridiculous trope that Lincoln was a dictator. An accusation that actually came from his opponents during the war and has resurrected itself from time to time ever since the war. He was not a dictator. The fact that the government conducted the 1864 election at all proves to the contrary. I don't think we consider that. Remember, Civil War, and yet we moved to a ballot. We hold a legal election during that conflict. We could maybe not have. We can, however, question whether the administration needed to conduct all of the dirty business that happened in order to win the war. Some of the arrests and activities do seem excessive. I hope you were at least a little surprised, as I was frankly surprised, by what took place, including and especially the extent of interference at the ballot box. But I also expect there are those of you in the audience who are nodding your heads and saying about Lincoln, good for him. He did what he needed to do. And here's why I come down on the side of good for him, even frankly as I sometimes cringe at this position. Remembering some of our emotions from 9/11, I think, starts us down the path of appreciation for the thought processes that occurred in the Civil War. After the Twin Towers came down, I think we can all remember the shock that we felt, the helplessness, the sheer outrage. We hungered to learn more about the enemy. We wanted to have accurate intelligence. There was some fumbling in the dark at first, uncertainty about what to do, other than the desire to take some kind of action, some kind of hard response. And the public, I think we would agree, was fully complicit in urging the administration to take stern measures and be supportive of the arrests and the creation of new bureaucracies to handle the crisis. At the time, only one congressperson voted against the authorization for use of military force that empowered President Bush to take whatever action he deemed necessary. But we also can't measure the past by our own time. The way 9/11 helped close ranks among many Americans echoes how Civil War era Northerners found unity. But the country then is not the country now. Intelligence procedures and an internal security system were virtually non-existent. They were not there at all. There was no Federal Bureau of Investigation. There was no Central Intelligence Agency. It may surprise you, there was not even a Department of Justice. And no Department of Homeland Security came into being. The government then had little idea about how to identify, much less to handle, internal threats during a time when treason seemed to be everywhere. And it may surprise you to know that in 1861, 1862, in that winter, the Congress had something called a Potter Committee, which operated just like Senator Joseph McCarthy and tried to purge all these suspicious traitors from the federal offices. And it did seem to be the traitors sat in government offices. Remember, many of them were appointed by Democratic administrations leading up to the war, and they were suspect at that time. And by the way, spies did betray troop information to the enemy. Confederates also, this may not be in your lexicon for the Civil War, planned and executed terrorist strikes across the Canadian border, including a botched plot to burn down I think, about 5 hotels in New York City. The Greek fire that was used actually fizzled. They weren't experienced enough in this kind of warfare. They were trying to kill thousands of people in New York City hotels with Greek fire. Money, by the way, for that did come from the Confederate government. People within communities persecuted their neighbors simply for cheering for Jefferson Davis. Nervous generals sent messages to superiors about traitors lurking at home who might use violence to dissuade Unionists from voting. You bet the administration overstepped some boundaries. But because of the excessive nature of the threat and the uncertainty in how to identify and handle it, I find many of the actions understandable, even frankly as I wince at the image of a bloody judge being dragged from the bench by soldiers. We really should be careful about reaching back for such precedents because not all means serve every time. But I think we should never forget that such is the dirty business that goes into conducting and winning a great war. Thank you. And we do have time for questions or comments if you like. Yes, sir. Think he's going to drag the microphone over?
He's a little slow. You mentioned that the actions were understandable. Would you call them defensible as well?
Yeah, I would defend them, actually, even though, to be honest, there are ones singularly I can't defend. I mean, I can't defend what Captain Moore did at that polling place in Maryland. That's just ridiculous. But Lincoln's not actually ordering that particular event, and in fact, it's these guys on the ground doing some things that are actually getting out in front. I think that what always made me think that these are defensible is that anytime we walked out to the edge of the constitutional precipice, Lincoln reached and went, okay, stop. Don't go further than that. And I think with some of the election shenanigans, frankly, it's almost like an extension of the political culture that existed at the time. I think Democrats would have done the same thing, to be honest. But again, it's Lincoln finally reaching out every moment that we almost went too far and pulling back. No, don't control the churches. No, let's hold the election in 1864. And honestly, the 1864 election was one of the calmest, cleanest elections in U.S. history to that point, which is remarkable, actually. Even though they were worried about New York security during that time period because of the New York draft riots that occurred the year before. They had steamships on order waiting to actually go back into New York City if there were any cases of unrest. They were using telegraphs to try to figure out if soldiers were needed. So there was edginess. But the election went off beautifully. So I don't know. You may disagree, but that's where I am with this question. It's not an easy question. It really isn't. That's it. Thank you. Appreciate it.